This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 361. Has Brexit stymied the UK recovery?
Self-employed, small traders, those businesses, they were the ones that voted Brexit. They were the ones that wanted an easing, a lifting of the burdens. And actually, it's from those millions of people that you get genuine economic growth.
That's
been forgotten.
But that's at the moment, it seems that we're in the worst of all worlds.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, the UK is recovering slower than just about anyone from the pandemic. Our GDP is flat compared to where it was 4 years ago, whereas most countries have recovered from the pandemic and then some. So why is the UK struggling? Why is growth slow? Why is inflation so high and so sluggish at coming down? The obvious question, has Brexit got something to do with it? And does a growing trade deficit have anything to do with it as well? We'll look at all of that today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So how much of the slow recovery in the UK is because of Brexit, because of disrupted supply chains and a lack of labour? So, Steve, the OECD is forecasting for the UK GDP this year is going to be a recession, minus 0.4% for whole growth for this year, and only 0.2% next year. It's pretty tragic, isn't it? The euro area, they're forecasting 0.5% growth this year, although that will probably be revised down because, of course, China's not going anywhere. They're forecasting China's going to grow at 4.6% this year, but that's not going to happen. So that's going to impact the euro area because of Germany's reliance on China for exports. So nobody is doing particularly well. Europe overall seems to be in a bad place, but the UK is in a particularly bad place. So you look at all of this and you go, well, okay, how much of this is down to Brexit? Or if we've got a situation where Europe's not doing very well either, maybe it really doesn't matter whether Brexit happened or not. What do you reckon? As somebody who was supportive of Brexit, as I keep on reminding you every time we speak.
You do. I mean, I made the mistake of accepting the polls. The polls said it was going to fail. And I thought, okay, I'll whack it as a protest vote because what I thought was protesting about was the EU itself.
You're just being the usual contrarian. Whatever the tide of public opinion is.
Holy shit, the vote won?
Yeah.
Oh, God, okay. And then, of course, I wasn't at all considering the impact on the UK. What I hope was to be a wake-up call for Brussels. Well, give that so much for that. I mean, Europe's... I mean, if this had been the Battle of Trafalgar, I'd now be speaking French. Okay? It was appallingly badly managed all the way down through. Yes, if I could go back in time, I would not get out of bed. I'd go and vote on the other side.
Yeah.
It's absurd. And it certainly has added to the malaise that the UK is suffering from. But it's also a malaise coming out of conventional thinking about economics and debt. And one thing I highly recommend people to get hold of is Richard Vague's next book, which is coming out very shortly, called The Paradox of Debt. And he makes a point, and it's quite a straightforward monetary point. Money is created by either the private sector going into debt or the government going into debt. And if you have a private sector that will no longer borrow, for rather good reasons at the moment, given
because how are you going to get a return?
Interest rates.
Yeah.
And you have a government that's obsessed about not running deficits when in fact that's what it should be doing.
Yeah, you have an economy that
you're
shrinks.
not going to get any monetary growth. And then if you then also you hit yourself with a trade sector and the difficulty now of getting goods out of the UK into the rest of the world, then that's a triple whammy of malaise, and it's no wonder the Britain's at the bottom of the pile.
Yeah, but that malaise, people would borrow, wouldn't they, if we saw that the economy was growing? So it's a bit of a circular argument in a way, isn't it, that we're not going to borrow because we're not getting a return.
I think we're actually at the ceiling level now, and this is, when you take a look at what happened with, the complete lack of knowledge of private debt is one of the main reasons why politicians have no idea of how the economy is actually going to go. Ditto for the lack of awareness about government debt as well. I mean, it's just you look at it and you've got two stupid attitudes about fundamental elements of
on both sides of politics.
On both sides of politics, there's no way Starmer's going to reform knowledge on the.
He's going to be fiscally conservative and he's going to balance the budget. In fact, I think he's probably arguing he's going to balance the budget faster than the Tories are. So,
I know.
Look at me, I can do it even worse, faster.
I can shoot both feet off at once.
Yeah.
I get one bullet rather than two.
But is the whole Brexit thing making inflation? So you touched on it there about supply chains. I mean, inflation is that much worse in Britain, and this is supply chain driven inflation. So the fact that you can't get stuff out or into the country, and we've had that extra barrier of Brexit adding complexity and cost, would explain why we've been sitting around 10.5%. As the headline inflation rate. The retail price index got up to about 12.5 or 13%, way worse than most other places.
Yeah, and including America. America's looking at heading back down to 4% and even 2% inflation again. So the supply chain disruptions. They're not gone, but they're diminished in America and most of the rest of the world. The UK, they're still hitting it, and have an incredible dependence upon imported food, and that to me is the biggest worry with the climate we face.
Yeah, but even without that, I mean, you're always going to have imported food because. All the interesting stuff that you want to eat, unless you're happy with turnips and potatoes, you've got to import food because all the interesting stuff comes from other parts of the world.
Yeah, but again, this is the lack of investment in the UK is ultimately the cause of all of these woes. The whole focus upon let's not spend, let's save money for a rainy day type attitude, as Keynes argued back in the 1930s, that is the widow's cruse. If your spending is somebody else's income, if you try to restrain spending, you're also restraining income, and then that's strange because you're trying to make income grow. So it ends up just being caught in the mistake of extrapolating what happens at the micro level to the macro.
Yeah.
And this you just look at it and you think Keynes in particular would be spinning at high speed in his grave because the country of his birth is the one that's most mangling the insights he wanted to communicate.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be an economist, do you, to understand that if you want a country to operate more efficiently, you've got to invest in infrastructure. You've got to have a health service so that people aren't sick. You've got to have roads.
A rail service that works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you had difficulty getting here today, but mainly because of strike action, because they're not paying the rail workers enough, of course.
Yeah.
And obviously a road infrastructure as well that's not jam-packed full of cars queuing end to end, or at least provide an alternative so they don't have to get in the car in the first place. So, that infrastructure investment is happening slowly here, and that's part and parcel of it, because, again, it's fiscal conservatism. Can't invest in public infrastructure, that costs money.
That's why the MMT argument, I think, is so important, because it points out the government should be running a deficit. That's what creates fiat money. We live in a capitalist economy with two ways of creating money, fundamentally. Fiat, which is government spending more than it takes back in taxation, or private debt, which is the banks lending out more than they take back in repayments.
And that's fine too. I mean, if that's creating money, and it's if it was to happen, but as we've spoken about, banks don't want to take the risk, obviously.
Well, we've reached back to the level of private debt again. We went from Britain having the figures the Bank of England publishes have been revised recently, so I've got to change my basic reference numbers. But if you take a look at the data they're now publishing, they're saying that the level of private debt in the UK up to 1982 was 60% of GDP. Yeah? Then Maggie Thatcher deregulated housing lending, so rather than building societies alone, you then had banks being allowed. Whammo, we have 3 times the level, 180% of GDP.
Yeah,
over about a 20 or 30.
So you could do with right, but you can do with some growth in the.
But you've reached the point
if it's there and it's useful debt that's actually contributing to the growth of GDP, of course. But the fact that it keeps on getting up, then
it's mainly debt that's gone into pumping up house prices. And again, you take a look about
rather than productive debt. So productive debt would be borrowing to invest in a firm or building infrastructure, which can be done by the private sector. It doesn't have to be done by the public sector. If the private sector sees an opportunity to bang up a new motorway and make it a toll road, then good luck to them, surely.
Or better train carriages.
Yeah.
The lack of infrastructure investment in general, the lack of industrial development is what makes the UK the outstanding failure that it now is.
Yeah, because there's no plan, actually. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So just on the rail carriages, for example, if you are running a rail franchise, which was a crazy idea, but that's where we are right now, although they are bit by bit being brought back into public hands because they can't make a profit. But if you were there and you were told, well, you've got 6 years, you're not going to invest a lot in infrastructure without knowing that, in 12 years' time, you might not be running that train company
Actually, I've
anymore.
got to put a shout out to Avner Offer, who's one of my Patreon supporters and a fellow academic. I met again at the book launch for Richard Vague's The Paradox of Debt at the RSA last week. And Avner,
No, so it wasn't last week. It was a few weeks. It was a few weeks ago now, Steve. You're losing all track of time.
about 1 week.
A few weeks.
2 weeks? Okay, all right. Pardon me. Okay, it's been a busy couple of weeks. But Avner made the point.
Or we just record these podcasts quite a few weeks in advance. It could be that as well.
It could be that. It could be that
God,
as well.
How
Yeah,
long does it take for you to catch on?
Oh my God! Yes, thank you very much. I've been slapped in the face by a dead parrot.
We're both doing quite a bit of travel, so
I think you better change a break to the ad now, so we can actually make up a little stuff up.
No. Go on, we'll go on with it. Don't worry.
When I spoke to Avner at the launch for Richard Vague's book
weeks ago,
Avner made the point that we've always been paralysed by this debate between public and private sector. What should be private? What should be public? You have extremes on both sides of politics. The old left-wing communist commanding heights type doctrine that came out of Marx and that was partly the Labor Party attitudes at the beginning of the post-war period. That basically said as much as possible should be publicly owned. Then you have the Tory, the libertarian Austrian attitude. The public sector should be limited to police and military, if that. If you read Milton Friedman's Son, even that he reckons should be privatised. So there's extremes, two extremes. And the real world is a yin and yang of the two.
Yeah.
They've both got their place. But how do you write the dividing line? And Avner took a lead from something that I first introduced him to, which is the arguments by John Blatt about the payback period being the sensible way that real corporations decide whether to invest.
So if it's a short-term payback period, then that's okay for the private sector. If it's a long-term payback period,
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So the payback period is the dividing line between whether it should be private sector or public sector.
A few years.
If renewal of infrastructure falls within the payback period of the private sector, then it's okay to have the private sector doing it. But if you're something like rail or sewerage or water, etc., that's public sector because the payback period makes no sense for the private sector to invest in that and get it.
All of those problems that we're talking about,
they all come down to that issue.
Yeah, and it actually very little to do with Brexit. So I mean, we can't lay the blame on the state of the UK right now on Brexit. It may have made things worse.
Brexit's a symptom of the stupidity that has meant that Britain's paralysed itself about investing both by the private sector and by the public for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And if only, time travel is one of these wonderful fantasies we all, indulge in. Back to the Future, Star Trek in the other direction, etc., etc. I would love to be able to grab Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and fast forward them 50 years from when they were saying how wonderful it was going to be to reduce the size of the public sector.
Like the Ghost of Christmas Future.
Exactly. But whack them, pop them in a train and put, not let them see the scenery on the outside and get them to guess which country they're in. Yeah. And if you put them in a European train, they'd guess they're in England. And if you put them in an English train, they'd guess they're in Europe. Yeah. Because in their opinion, we've deregulated, we're going to get investment growth. None of it has happened. Absolutely none of it.
So it's understandable, part of the reason why people were so keen on Brexit, supposedly 52% of the population. I mean, I'm sure a chunk of those will be tradespeople who saw other tradespeople coming over from Europe, from Poland in particular, offering work for much less. You can't get cheap jobs now. Try and get anything done in the house costs a fortune because it's going to be done by a good old British worker charging good old British wages, which they've got to because they've got a pension, they've got a mortgage, they probably want to have a pension, they've got to meet the standard of living, and they don't want to work for nothing. So, all that work has gone up in price. So that will have added to inflation as well, of course, the cost of everything else. But we've still got a whole lot of people coming into the country. It's just they're different people coming into the country. So rather than coming from Poland, we had a record net migration of 500,000 people. Net, I think it was 1 million people in total, but net 500,000 people in the year to June last year. And of course, a chunk of that was because we let people in from Hong Kong, and then we did the decent thing for Ukraine.
Yeah.
So, but of course, a lot of that won't be productive immigration. There'll be people who, well, maybe from Hong Kong, but probably from Ukraine. It's mums and daughters, isn't it, who probably weren't working in Ukraine, possibly aren't working here, possibly don't know the language too well. We've sort of like said, well, okay, let's take away all the productive immigration and replace it with unproductive immigration, which is where we are now. So we're getting to the stage where you can start saying, well, immigration is a cost rather than actually being a benefit.
I'm not so sure about that argument, but certainly a major source of the appeal of Brexit was the low wages that you get. Workers coming in from, particularly not Central European countries, Romania and countries like that, and that undercutting the wages they saw themselves getting, and that was a major reason for saying, let's not have freedom of movement anymore. And freedom of movement itself is something which, again, is it's one of these notions that comes out of mainstream economic thinking that doesn't look at the spatial effects of major changes like that. So like there are parts of, I've been through parts of Croatia where villages have populations of 0 because everybody's moved out of the village to the capital and from the capital to other parts of Europe. And you get where there's growth going on, you get more growth there, and it doesn't cause the spread of economic activity that the ideology argues for. So I can understand the resistance to freedom of movement. But the end result of it has been just economic constipation yet again, adding on to the previous sins of being the country that probably most vocally championed deregulation and privatisation.
And we do have freedom of movement within the UK. Like if you're earning vast quantities of money in the south of England, you are free to move to the north and sign on the dole. If you're in the north, you're free to move and get a job in the southeast because that's where all the jobs are.
3.5 times your salary is your rent. Yep.
Well, yeah. But so
what we get is a price distribution that means the place is paralysed, and if you're poor, you've got to stay in the regions where you are poor. And
hence we get that divide. So so freedom of movement within the UK isn't working particularly well, even though it's there and it's open to everybody, should they choose to accept it. So it's just on a local scale, the issue that we're seeing on a European-wide scale, isn't it? So I'm not sure if it makes it any worse or any better having that freedom of movement. Of course, indeed, what it does do is stop the other way, the opportunity the other way.
The advantage in terms of the European Union and freedom of movement, and the reason why it was argued for is that the biggest European countries, a population of 70, 80 million people, they're competing against America with 250, or a market of 250 million, and China, over 1 billion people. And what you get is economies of scale in the firms themselves. Okay. That was the reason for saying you want to have a European market, and then Philips can sell not just to Holland but to the whole of Europe, and you therefore get capacity to build bigger factories and better economies of scale and so on. Now, there's a slight flaw in your English argument about that, because you've been shutting your factories down rather than extending them and expanding them during the period when you were part of the European Union.
Well, what we're doing is we've switched what was, in effect, a domestic market into an international market, haven't we? So if you were a small-scale operator, for example, and you were making something that you were selling within the UK and selling within Europe as well, you've got this extra layer of administration now. For example, you have to register for VAT within Europe, whereas you didn't have to before. So you've then got to do all of your filing of tax returns in Europe and all the administration costs associated with that, which we didn't have before because we were all just one big happy market. So we've shot ourselves in the foot a bit that way.
In that sense, definitely. I mean, I was in favour of shutting down the European Union from the point of view of the Eurozone. The whole focus on the euro, the focus on austerity, the Maastricht Treaty, all those are disastrous elements of the European vision. But the positive element of the European vision was this idea of economies of scale and being able to make Europe, cohesive enough to have the economies of scale that America and China already had before. Certainly, they weren't thinking about China when the EU was formed, but certainly America. The idea was to have a European continent market similar to the American continental market, and then with that big domestic market, you could build large firms which could compete with the Americans. That was the primary, and that's valid. Okay, but on the top of that, we overlaid the ordoliberal obsession about keeping government debt down and keeping deficits down.
But some elements of the Maastricht Treaty...
UK had the worst of that without the other stuff.
Yeah. But some elements of the Maastricht Treaty, even without the euro, perhaps are necessary. I want to look at that when we come back. We're going to take a quick break. It is the Debunking Economics podcast. It's me, it's Steve Keen, recorded clearly a few weeks ago now, and back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we were talking about, Britain better off in or out of the EU. You mentioned the Maastricht Treaty, and even let's talk about, do we go back in now? And if we did go back in, if the UK rejoined, God, you wouldn't want them to rejoin and have to be part of the euro.
Absolutely not.
That would be suicidal.
Totally suicidal. The only good thing that was done by Maggie and friends at that stage, and it was well before we formed, but was saying no, and we're going to hang on to the pound.
Yeah.
And that therefore meant you had an independent Treasury. You could have done the right thing. You did the wrong thing by hanging on to the pound at the same time, imposing your own versions of austerity and destroying the infrastructure of the country at the same time.
Well, we got out quite early, didn't we, really? Because there was the exchange rate mechanism, which was trying to tie all the currencies together. We got out of that because we could see the danger involved in that. But you do need, even without the euro, if you've got a series of countries that are all competing in effect domestically within the EU, you do need rules. So you do need some sort of treaty to say, well, hang on, we can't sell stuff in our country if your government is heavily subsidizing that sector and we're not. You need to have rules so that it's a level playing field, don't you?
Yeah, you do to some extent. I mean, but at the same time, the American states compete with each other on the same front. And this is one reason that government, when it comes to bargaining between government and the private sector, the governments almost always lose because the private sector's got a capacity to play, 50 governments off against each other if we talk of the American state governments, or 20 or so in the European Union. And that gives them enormous bargaining power. So you do need to have rules that are at the national level in the case of America, the supranational level in the case of the European Union, to prevent that sort of beggar thy neighbour policies being used by one state against another, which really ends up benefiting the owners of the corporations because they're the ones who get they get the subsidies, they get the lower tax rates and so on. So yeah, you do have to have the rules at that level. Just the rules should have been nothing to do with the government level of deficit spending. It should have been about, for example, can Ireland offer a lower tax rate to Apple to encourage Apple to move to Ireland, which is precisely what it did.
Yeah.
Okay? Now that's the sort of thing you should be banning.
Yeah, but they get away with
allowed.
it. Yeah. Exactly. Doesn't make a great deal of sense, does it? And then, obviously, the British approach from those people who were arguing in favour of Brexit is that, well, the great thing is that we can align ourselves with countries where there is growth. So getting back to the OECD forecast, for right now, the countries that they are saying are going to have relatively high growth this year, Saudi Arabia, 5% growth, India, 5.7% growth, Turkey, 3% growth. Okay, you've got to look at the base on some of these. Indonesia, 4.7%. We should be doing trade with Indonesia. Forget about dealing with France just over the way there. Just deal with Indonesia on the other side of the world. So naturally, Brexiteers are saying these are the countries we should be aligning ourselves with, even though these are the same people who said, well, we don't think we should stay in the EU because Turkey might become part of the EU. But hey, now look at the growth we're getting in Turkey. We should be doing some trade with them. Are we going to get more? What are we going to sell to them? What do we sell to Saudi Arabia? What do they want to buy from us?
Well,
we know what we're going to buy from them.
A lot of Western history relates back to that very question when with the invasion of China. And people, I occasionally have a bit of fun saying, do you ever hear about the Opium Wars? Okay. And we were fighting to stop China exporting heroin to Europe. I'm sorry, you were fighting to allow Europe to export heroin to China, and the Chinese tried to stop you. So yeah, there's various times. If you go back to the 19th century, there was nothing that China really wanted of European manufacturing, especially English. That's why we call crockery China.
Yeah.
Okay. It came from China. The best quality stuff by far was the Chinese. There was nothing that Europe had selling in the other direction that the Asians particularly wanted. And you've now managed to recreate that situation
it's actually
in the early 21st century.
Yeah, a British export is the pottery. Potteries from the north of England is still an export from the Stoke-on-Trent and around there. There's still towns.
But if you want, well, for a while you'd have things like Rolls-Royce jet engines and things of that nature.
Yeah.
You still have that to some extent. But in terms of the quality
now
of
we make cups for the tea we drink. Now we make cups for the tea that we drink. That's you'd expect Britain to a bit of vertical integration there. We drink tea, therefore let's make the cups that we drink the tea out of.
Which you import from China.
well, maybe not now. We do have a domestic business there.
But you have again the Asian economies in the 19th, certainly China in the 19th century, prior to the colonial period, it missed out on obviously steam technology and there was a reason the Industrial Revolution began in Europe rather than Asia. But in terms of the quality of manufacturing, they had an advantage over the Europeans back in the 19th century, and they've got an advantage now. So it's very hard to imagine what Britain could export to China.
But, maybe we'll sidestep the argument that some modern monetary theorists have that, actually importing more and exporting less puts you in a good situation. Let's take the more conventional thinking that, no, that doesn't make sense. We have quite a significant trade deficit in the UK. So in 2020 to 2022... Sorry, 21 to 22, I think it is. In that year, anyway, we imported 644 billion in goods and services in pounds and exported 414 billion. So that is a 230 billion pound trade deficit.
Which is how much of that is a percentage of GDP?
I'm not quite sure.
That's got to be heading towards 10%.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's not healthy, is it?
Not at all. And this is I'm a critic of that particular line of MMT. If you don't industrially develop, you're going to lose competitively over time. Of course, climate change comes back in yet again, but leaving that out. If you're looking at the competing against other economies which are technologically advancing faster than you are, you're going to lose. And Britain has been going backwards on that front for 40 years.
But I do hear economists arguing that if you've got a healthy level of imports, then that could be a good thing. So because it shows your domestic consumption is strong. So in America, it doesn't seem to be a problem, does it? They've got a trade deficit, but we look and say, the US economy is doing well because they're importing more, because they have...
Well, the US is a unique situation that it's got the global currency.
Yeah.
And I don't regard that as a sensible thing to do. But what it means is you need American dollars for trade. You don't need British pound for trade. So if Britain is importing far more than it's exporting, then it's ultimately weakening its capacity to produce domestically, and it's at some point it may lose what MMT crowds call monetary sovereignty by not having that industrial capacity. So whereas when the export scale of countries like China is so great, and Japan, it's got monetary sovereignty. So I think there's that's one part of MMT that I think is based on a silly one-liner rather than a really deep insight, which is where the modern monetary attitude to government deficits came from.
It doesn't even need great insight to say, well, actually it doesn't need great insight to think that having a positive balance of trade is a good thing, that you're actually making more and selling more than you're consuming seems just common sense, doesn't it, to most people? And yet we obviously are going the other way in Britain, and it's getting worse. So if we compare 2018 to 2022, exports went from 350 billion to 414 billion. So that's an 18% increase in exports over those years. These are in nominal terms. So, allow for inflation and all of that. But imports went from 489 billion to 644 billion. So that is a 31% increase. So the trade deficit obviously is getting worse. But as I say, there's some people would say, well, look at that import's going up by 31%. That's a healthy economy. We've got more consumption going on. But that's not sustainable, is it? If you're not creating the money from the imports that you're putting out there.
And that's my, that's why I argue that particular part of M&T actually contradicts his arguments about the creation of money, and is naive about how factories operate as well. Factories are not operating past capacity. I've heard people making this opportunity cost argument, including Bill Mitchell, arguing that opportunity cost is a good reason as to why imports are better than exports. But opportunity cost applies when you've got a fully employed system.
So what's his argument that if you're using money to buy stuff from overseas or using
you're
resources,
sending over pieces of paper and getting goods back. And they say the opportunity cost is all theirs, quote unquote, from Bill Mitchell. I think that's nonsense. Because it argues effectively that you could use the stuff that you're exporting if you didn't actually export it, and therefore you've got less productive capacity domestically. That implies a sort of a neoclassical vision of somebody who's got losing something when you sell something for trade. You could have used it yourself. If you sell it instead, losing the capacity to use that productive device for your own usage. That is a world in which you have fully employed capital goods, full utilisation. It's a neoclassical fantasy. It's never been the real world. Exports enable you to use more of your capacity than you would use otherwise, which reduces your per unit cost and gives you more money for investment and technological development over time. And that's a major reason why China and Japan and Korea and so many other countries that have industrialised from very low bases over the last 40 or 50 years have run export surpluses, because the export surplus finances their domestic development and also means that they're immune from worries about exchange rate volatility.
But then you get into an argument then for specialisation, though, don't you? Because you'd be saying, well, okay, we want to maximise our utilisation of factories or means of production, whatever it might be, and so you're going to focus on a few areas where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. That's
another neoclassical myth, because again, this is where I really recommend people to take a look at the Atlas of Economic Complexity, maintained by Harvard University's computing department, and that when you look at it, you find the countries which grow most rapidly, and again, the whole growth question and the guise of climate change. I know, I hate, I get stymied every time I talk about it now. But the countries which grow most rapidly have the most diversified industrial structures, not specialised. Specialisation is a trap. Because
but it depends on the size of the economy, surely. So if you've only got a handful of factories and a small population, then you want to get the maximum utilisation out of those factories, and you're going to focus on one or two specific industries.
Well, that comes back to the advantage of the free trade zone that the European Union created. Therefore, you've got a large scale to build across, and you can build large scale factories, and you get economies of scale out of the size of the factory you build for. If you're building for a population of 300 million rather than a population of 60 million, so that particular side is valid, but. When you look at economies like Germany being the classic example, economies which have grown and developed more rapidly over time, they have had not a specialised industrial structure but a highly diversified one. And the reason that gives you growth is that often new industries come about by combining old industries.
Yeah.
And my favourite example being sailboards. You combine sailing with surfing, and bang, you've got a new industry. You've got to have producers making both sails and surfboards in the one country. To get that
innovation.
For that. So that's the diversification gives you a chance to expand and grow over time.
So interestingly, you would have thought, well, okay, given all of this difficulty now in exporting and importing, that we're doing less trade with Europe, and I'm not actually sure that is the case. So in 2018, the UK exported more than 35 billion to Germany. It's only a little bit less than that now, but Netherlands has come into second place behind Germany for exports, and so that sort of add that to the figure, and there's not much difference. I think that's because the Netherlands now has become a bit of a staging post for the rest of Europe. So we're shipping stuff to the Netherlands. Maybe the paperwork's easier there, and then they are re-exporting domestically. So it's changed the trading pattern. But I think the total volume of trade, we're not exporting less to Europe than we were before. It's perhaps just become a bit more cumbersome. But Mervyn King, in his book, The End of Alchemy, he says, to explain this to me, an excess of imports over exports has a drag effect on demand. I would have thought actually it showed demand was too high, but anyway, he is saying total demand is domestic demand minus the trade deficit. And he goes on to say, and I quote, in order to ensure that total demand matched the capacity of their economies to produce, central banks in the deficit countries cut their official interest rates in order to boost domestic demand. That created an imbalance within these countries, with spending too high relative to the current and prospective incomes. In countries with trade surplus such as China and Germany, spending was too low relative to future likely incomes, and the imbalance between the countries, large trade surplus and deficits continued. So I'm trying to follow the logic here that if we've got an excess of imports over exports, that's got a drag effect on demand. Explain that to me, first of all.
Well, it's actually quite simple even when you look at this, the basic definition of GDP. One says GDP is consumption plus investments plus exports minus imports plus government spending minus taxation. So even the way you measure GDP says if imports increase, GDP falls.
Right,
okay? Yeah. And when you look again at Keynes's arguments for a post-World War II trade regime, he wanted to limit the scale of export surpluses. He wanted to have controls on access to the international currency, the Bancor. If you're in too large a trade surplus, then you face penalty rates of interest. And you have to encourage you not to have too large a set of too large a trade surplus. And he saw trade surplus nations as actually diminishing the growth of the economy. So his idea, when he, in fact, he's the opposite of MMT on that front. He said it's trade deficits. He saw attempting to have a trade surplus as being a positive for the country doing it and a negative for the global economy. So he wanted to have controls to stop countries running too large a trade surplus and force trade deficit countries to industrialise more than they were doing. I think that's the opposite of what MMT is arguing now.
But King is arguing here. He's saying what happened, and he was the central banker at the time. He was the head of the Bank of England. When all of this was going on, when they lowered interest rates down to next to buggery. I mean, his point. He's saying, well, yeah, we have this drag on demand because of the trade deficit. So we needed to boost up domestic demand. So we knocked interest rates down in the hope that would create future investment that would help the economy grow.
What you got instead was asset price bubbles.
Yeah, so it didn't work, did it?
No.
But also, it doesn't explain why those countries with a trade surplus would be doing the same thing. Why would they be lowering their interest rates down to zero, for example?
Well, because interest rates themselves are not a major determinant of investment. Okay? Again, that's another piece of...
But by his logic, they are. That's what he's saying. So he sort of moved over.
I would never accuse a neoclassical central banker of having logic that's worth following.
All right, okay. Well, so, I mean, where does this leave us? It leaves us with the question about, was Brexit a good idea or not?
Well, I think categorically it was a bad idea.
Yeah.
Okay? And even like my belief was it could be used as a way of getting the EU to realise it has to change its own policies. It was handled so badly it actually strengthened the EU's policies rather than weakened them. And if I'd seen the political absurdity that's going to flow after it, I would have been one of the many fighting against it, despite the fact that I think the Eurozone side of the European Union deserves to go.
Yeah, and if we stay in the position we're in, are we just going to see our GDP slide because we are going to see that trade deficit, as we have seen in the last couple of years? We're going to see that trade deficit starting to broaden. I think we are going to go back in. I think there was a poll. They're calling it regret now. Rather than Brexit, it's regret. There's a poll by PMG Polling for the I newspaper. 45% of the electorate believe Britain should rejoin the EU. 40% said we should stay out. 14% weren't sure. But if you look at 18 to 24-year-olds, 62% were in favour of rejoining. Only 15% were against the idea.
You know, what I can see coming out of this, and I hate to, this would be a nice note to end the podcast on, but I think I can quite possibly see us going back into the European Union and accepting the euro and abolishing the pound, and that'd be yet another catastrophe on top of
that. That would be
others.
the worst outcome of all of them,
and therefore it's the most likely one.
Well, do you know, or maybe this time it's sensibly debated. You know, maybe Nigel Farage has to leave the country because no one will give him a bank account, and he has to stay out. And so he's not part of the equation, and so we get some logic being argued and involving the EU in that logic. And maybe there's other countries aren't too happy about the euro either, like Greece, for example, all the southern European nations. And maybe the idea that why don't we go back to the way we were? We'll have a trading currency, but everyone goes back to their original currencies. Get the drachma out of the basement, start using that again, and just disband the euro.
And the last 30 seconds review by Walt Disney.
Well, but then if it's not working, it's not working.
Yeah, but I mean, we've got so many elements not working all at once. It's a question not of which one do you reform, but which one breaks first.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, there we are. Brought to you by Walt Disney. Thank you for that. Look, just quickly before we go, and next week, by the way, we're going to talk about house prices, one of your favourites.
Oh,
who's winning on the high house prices we're seeing? Because I'm not seeing building companies necessarily reporting mega profits. And we know it's going to the finance industry, so there's a bit of a spoiler alert, but we'll explore that a bit more next week. A couple of people have written in, by the way. So Kristen Watkins says, you're doing the stuff over Christmas where you're looking at individual economists.
Yeah.
Can you do some more of those? I'd like to see Hyman Minsky and Michael Kalecki.
Yep.
So we'll push that in a few weeks' time.
Yep.
We'll start doing some of those again. Melanie Smith, I'm not sure whether we can do this. I live in Canada, so I'd love to hear an episode or series of episodes of you both roasting, there we are, predetermine what our decision is, on Canada's economic decisions, like corporate bailouts or dismal public transport. Hey, Melanie, got to come to Britain. Airlines... maybe cover some historical stuff like the National Energy Programme. I feel like Steve will have some strong opinions. Will also happen to be truths, despite what my conservative province would believe. I'd love to hear what they've messed up here and how you both figure we could do better. I don't actually know.
We might drag Ty in for that particular conversation.
Right. Yes, of course, because he's over there. Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. Well, there are, Melanie. We'll organise that in a month or so as well. Good to have you again today. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again next week, Steve.
Bye-bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.